Passchendaele, a name forever etched in the history of World War I, evokes images of endless mud, relentless rain, and the unimaginable suffering of soldiers caught in one of the bloodiest battles of the Great War. Officially known as the Third Battle of Ypres, the fighting at Passchendaele claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, many of whom were swallowed by the mud, never to be seen again. The land was scarred beyond recognition, a nightmarish landscape where even the dead could not rest. But for some, the horrors of Passchendaele did not end with the war. In the years since the battle, locals and visitors alike have reported eerie occurrences on the old battlefield. Strange lights, ghostly figures, and disembodied voices are said to haunt the fields where so many perished. It is as though the land itself remembers the suffering, and the spirits of the soldiers who died there still wander the muddy terrain, unable to find peace. In this article, we explore 4 haunting tales from Passchendaele's haunted fields. Each story delves into the experiences of those who have encountered the ghosts of the battlefield, blending historical fact with chilling supernatural encounters that continue to haunt the living today. Story 1. The Soldier in the Shell Hole. The mud of Passchendaele claimed the lives of countless soldiers who sank into the muck and were never seen again. Their bodies became part of the land, lost to history, but not, it seems, forgotten. Among the many ghostly sightings in this battlefield, the story of the soldier in the shell hole stands out as one of the most disturbing. This tale comes from Edward Morris, a British historian and tourist who had a terrifying encounter on the site in the 1980s. His experience with a mud-covered, spectral soldier emerging from a shell hole has become one of the most infamous ghost stories associated with Passchendaele. The landscape around Passchendaele is marked by deep craters and shell holes left from the intense artillery bombardments that turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire during the battle. These holes, filled with water and debris, became graves for many soldiers who were swallowed by the mud during the fighting. The particular shell hole where Edward's experience took place is located near the heart of the battlefield, an area that saw some of the heaviest fighting in late 1917. Edward had come to Passchendaele on the anniversary of the battle, hoping to connect with the history of the war that had fascinated him since childhood. He was drawn to the battlefield not just as a historian, but as a man seeking to understand the human cost of war. But what he found there was far more than he had bargained for. Edward had spent the morning walking through the fields of Passchendaele, marveling at how peaceful the landscape seemed compared to the images of destruction he had seen in books. The muddy wasteland that had once swallowed soldiers whole was now a quiet, green expanse, dotted with memorials and cemeteries. But as the afternoon wore on, the sky darkened and a thick mist began to roll in from the horizon, giving the place an eerie, otherworldly quality. Edward found himself drawn to a large shell hole near the center of the battlefield. The hole, half filled with stagnant water, seemed to radiate a strange energy. As he stood at the edge, peering into the murky depths, he was overcome with an inexplicable sense of dread. The air felt heavy, as though the land itself was pressing down on him, and the silence was absolute. It was then that he saw it, a figure slowly emerging from the mud at the bottom of the shell hole. At first, Edward thought it was an illusion, perhaps a trick of the light or a strange reflection on the water's surface. But as he watched, the figure became more defined. It was a man, dressed in a tattered, mud-soaked uniform, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, hollow and lifeless, stared straight ahead as he rose from the water, his body covered in mud and debris. The soldier's hand, caked with mud, reached out toward Edward as if pleading for help. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Edward could only stand there, frozen in place, as the soldier's gaze locked onto his. In that moment, Edward felt an overwhelming surge of despair, as though the weight of the entire battle had been laid upon his shoulders. The soldier continued to rise, his body emerging fully from the shell hole, standing at the edge of the crater just a few feet from Edward. His uniform was soaked through, and his face was a mask of pain and sorrow. Edward wanted to run, to scream, but he found himself unable to move, paralyzed by the sight of this ghostly figure. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the soldier vanished, dissolving into the mist. The air around Edward was deathly cold, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind through the grass. The shell hole, once filled with the ghostly figure, was now empty, its surface undisturbed. Shaken to his core, Edward stumbled away from the shell hole, his heart pounding in his chest. He could still feel the weight of the soldier's gaze upon him, as if the ghostly figure had left a mark on his soul. For the rest of his visit, Edward felt as though he was being watched, and every step he took was accompanied by the faint sound of distant footsteps echoing through the battlefield. When he returned to England, Edward struggled to make sense of what he had seen. He told his story to friends and colleagues, but most dismissed it as a figment of his imagination. Some suggested that the emotional intensity of the battlefield had played tricks on his mind, while others speculated that he had seen a reflection or an animal emerging from the mud. But Edward knew what he had witnessed: a soldier trapped in the mud of Passchendaele, reliving his final moments over and over again. It wasn't just an illusion, he would later say. That soldier was real. He's still there, trapped in that shell hole, waiting for someone to pull him out. For Edward, the encounter with the ghostly soldier was more than just a frightening experience. It was a moment that changed his life. He had always approached history from a scholarly perspective, viewing the events of World War I through the lens of research and analysis. But after his encounter at Passchendaele, Edward began to see the war in a different light. He realized that the men who fought and died in the trenches were not just names in a history book. They were real people, with real emotions, whose spirits might still linger on the battlefields where they perished. Edward never returned to Passchendaele after that day, but the memory of the soldier in the shell hole haunted him for the rest of his life. He often wondered if the ghostly figure was one of the thousands of soldiers whose bodies were never recovered, lost to the mud and chaos of the battlefield. "He's still out there," Edward would say, "still waiting for someone to find him." The story of the soldier in the shell hole is a powerful reminder of the horror and futility of the Battle of Passchendaele. The mud of the battlefield claimed thousands of lives, with many soldiers disappearing without a trace, their bodies swallowed by the muck and never recovered. The ghostly figure that Edward encountered may represent the souls of those lost men, forever bound to the battlefield where they perished. The mud of Passchendaele became a symbol of the senseless brutality of war, a place where men drowned in the earth itself, unable to escape the hell of the trenches. For many, the battlefield remains haunted by the spirits of those who died there, their restless souls still searching for peace in the land that consumed them. Story 2. The Phantom Voices in Incite Cemetery. Incite Cemetery, located near the town of Passchendaele, is the largest Commonwealth war cemetery in the world, with nearly 12,000 soldiers buried there. It is a place of solemn remembrance, where the names of the fallen are etched into stone, and the rows of white headstones stretch out in neat lines across the landscape. But for some visitors, the cemetery is not just a place of peace, it is a place where the dead still speak. The most common paranormal phenomenon reported at Incite Cemetery is the sound of phantom voices, disembodied whispers, and conversations that seem to drift on the wind, as though the spirits of the soldiers buried there are still talking to one another, long after their bodies were laid to rest. Incite Cemetery is a beautifully maintained memorial to the soldiers who fought and died during the Battle of Passchendaele. The cemetery is located on a hill, offering a sweeping view of the surrounding countryside, where the fields of battle once stretched for miles. The rows of headstones, each one marking the grave of a fallen soldier, are a stark reminder of the scale of the loss suffered during the war. At the center of the cemetery stands the Incite Memorial, which bears the names of nearly 35,000 men whose bodies were never found. The memorial is a place of quiet reflection, but for some visitors, it is also a place of eerie encounters. The phantom voices are most often heard in the late afternoon or evening, when the cemetery is quiet and the air is still. The whispers seem to come from nowhere, carried on the wind, but their presence is unmistakable. Marie Jacobs, a local historian and guide, had always found Incite Cemetery to be a place of deep emotional resonance. As a child, she would accompany her grandfather, a World War II veteran, to the cemetery on the anniversary of Armistice Day to pay their respects to the fallen soldiers. For Marie, the cemetery was a place of reflection where she could connect with the history of the war and honor the memory of those who had given their lives. But one evening, during a visit to the cemetery with a group of students, Marie experienced something that she could not explain. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden light over the rows of headstones. The air was cool and still, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. As the students wandered quietly among the graves, reading the inscriptions on the headstones, Marie found herself standing near the Tyne-Cot Memorial, gazing out over the cemetery. It was then that she heard the first voice, a faint whisper, so soft that she almost didn't notice it at first. The voice seemed to come from just behind her, but when she turned to look, there was no one there. Confused, Marie looked around, thinking that perhaps one of the students had approached her without her noticing, but the nearest person was several yards away. The whisper came again, this time clearer, though Marie still couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a man's voice, low and urgent, as though he was speaking in hushed tones. Marie's heart began to race as she realized that the voice was not coming from any living person. It was coming from the air around her, as though the wind itself was carrying the words. As she stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what she was hearing, the voice was joined by others. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to drift on the wind, surrounding her in a cocoon of sound. It was as though a group of men were engaged in a quiet conversation, their voices overlapping and blending together, but Marie couldn't understand what they were saying. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until it felt as though they were standing right beside her. Marie's hands shook as she clasped them together, whispering a prayer under her breath. She didn't know what else to do. The voices felt real, tangible, as though the spirits of the soldiers buried in the cemetery were speaking to one another, their conversations continuing even in death. After what felt like an eternity, the voices began to fade, growing softer until they disappeared altogether. The cemetery was silent once more, and Marie was left standing alone, her heart still pounding in her chest. She glanced around, half expecting to see the shadowy figures of the soldiers standing among the graves. But the cemetery was empty, save for her students, who were still quietly exploring the site. Marie hurried back to the group, her mind racing with what she had just experienced. She didn't mention the voices to the students, unsure of how to explain what had happened, but the memory of the encounter stayed with her long after she left Tyne-Cot that evening. Marie struggled to make sense of what she had heard at Tyne-Cot Cemetery. She had always been a rational person, grounded in facts and history, and she didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. But the voices she had heard that evening were too real, too distinct to be dismissed as a trick of the mind or the wind. In the days that followed, Marie spoke to several of her colleagues who worked as guides at the cemetery. To her surprise, many of them had experienced similar occurrences: phantom voices, strange sounds, and a palpable sense of presence in the air, as though the spirits of the soldiers buried at Tyne-Cot were still lingering, unable to move on. Marie returned to Tyne-Cot several more times in the months that followed, always hoping to hear the voices again, but the cemetery remained silent. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the soldiers were still there, their conversations continuing in the wind, their voices echoing through the air, long after their bodies had been laid to rest. For Marie, the experience of hearing the phantom voices at Tyne-Cot Cemetery was a turning point in her understanding of the war. She had always viewed the cemetery as a place of solemn remembrance, a place where the dead could finally rest in peace. But after hearing the voices, she realized that the soldiers who died at Passchendaele may not have found the peace they deserved. They're still talking to each other, Marie says softly. Still connected, even in death. It's as though they're waiting for something, perhaps for someone to acknowledge their presence, or for someone to hear their stories. Marie now believes that the phantom voices are the echoes of the soldiers who died during the Battle of Passchendaele, their spirits still bound to the land where they fought and died. For her, the cemetery has taken on a new significance, a place where the past and the present overlap, and where the voices of the dead can still be heard, carried on the wind. The phantom voices heard at Incite Cemetery are a haunting reminder of the thousands of lives lost during the Battle of Passchendaele. Many of the soldiers buried there were never identified, their names inscribed on the memorial for the missing. The voices that echo through the cemetery may represent the longing for connection that the soldiers felt during the war, a bond that has endured even in death. The voices also serve as a reminder of the enduring legacy of the Great War and the way in which the trauma of the conflict continues to resonate through history. For those who visit Incite, the experience of hearing the phantom voices is a poignant and powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the deep scars that remain, even after the guns fall silent. Story 3. The Lost Patrol on Polygon Wood. Polygon Wood, a dense forest located near the town of Zonnebeke, was the site of some of the fiercest fighting during the Battle of Passchendaele. The wood, once a place of serene beauty, was transformed into a nightmarish battlefield where soldiers fought and died in the mud and debris of the shattered trees. Among the many ghost stories associated with Polygon Wood, one of the most chilling is the tale of the Lost Patrol, a group of soldiers who became separated from their unit during the battle and were never seen again. To this day, visitors to Polygon Wood report seeing shadowy figures moving through the trees at dusk, their uniforms tattered and their faces obscured by the gloom. These spectral soldiers are believed to be the Lost Patrol, forever wandering the forest in search of their comrades, unable to find their way home. Polygon Wood, once a peaceful forest filled with tall trees and quiet paths, became a battleground of destruction during the Third Battle of Ypres. The trees were shattered by artillery fire, the ground churned into mud, and the once serene landscape was transformed into a desolate, hellish expanse. The fighting in Polygon Wood was brutal, with many soldiers becoming separated from their units in the chaos, their bodies never recovered. Today, Polygon Wood has been restored to some of its former beauty, with the trees growing tall once more, and the forest paths quiet and serene. But for those who visit, there is an undeniable sense that the past still lingers in the air, and the ghosts of the soldiers who fought and died there are still present, wandering the wood in search of their comrades. The most common sightings of the Lost Patrol occur near the Butte's New British Cemetery, which lies at the heart of Polygon Wood. This cemetery is the final resting place for many soldiers who died in the surrounding area, and it is here that visitors often report seeing shadowy figures moving silently through the trees, as if still on patrol. Tom Dawson, a Belgian history teacher and World War I enthusiast, had always been drawn to the battlefields of Flanders. As a child, he would listen to his grandfather's stories of the Great War, and as he grew older, he became fascinated with the history of the conflict. Tom had visited many of the key sites of the war, but Polygon Wood held a special significance for him. In the early 2000s, Tom decided to take a group of students to Polygon Wood as part of a history field trip. The students were eager to learn about the battle, and Tom was excited to share his knowledge of the area. As they walked through the forest, Tom told the students about the brutal fighting that had taken place there, the men who had died, and the many soldiers who had been lost in the chaos of battle. But as the group neared the Butte's New British Cemetery, Tom began to feel uneasy. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the trees, which had once felt comforting and familiar, now seemed to close in around him. The students continued their discussions, but Tom found himself distracted, his attention drawn to the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. After the tour, as the students prepared to leave, Tom decided to take one last walk through the wood. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the forest was eerily quiet. As he walked, Tom heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him, crunching softly on the leaves. He turned, expecting to see one of his students, but the path was empty. Unnerved, Tom quickened his pace, but the sound of footsteps followed him, always just a few paces behind. His heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, but the path remained empty. Finally, Tom stopped, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he scanned the trees for any sign of movement. And that's when he saw them. A group of soldiers, their figures barely visible in the fading light, standing at the edge of the trees. Their uniforms were ragged and torn, caked with mud, and their faces were hidden in shadow. They stood in silence, watching him, their rifles slung over their shoulders, as though waiting for orders. For a moment, Tom could only stare in disbelief. The soldiers looked real, solid, as though they had stepped out of the past and into the present. But there was something otherworldly about them, their stillness, the way they seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the soldiers began to move, walking slowly along the tree line, their boots crunching softly on the leaves. Tom watched as the soldiers disappeared into the forest, their figures fading into the darkness until they were gone. The sound of their footsteps lingered for a few moments longer, echoing through the wood, before finally fading into silence. Tom hurried back to his car, his mind racing with what he had just seen. He knew the history of Polygon Wood, the stories of men who had been lost in the chaos of battle, their bodies never found. But seeing the soldiers, hearing their footsteps, was something he couldn't explain. In the days that followed, Tom struggled to make sense of the encounter. He had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, but the soldiers he had seen in Polygon Wood felt real. He spoke to a few of his colleagues, but most of them dismissed the experience as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. But Tom knew what he had seen, a group of soldiers lost in the forest, still wandering the battlefield where they had died. "They're still out there," he would later say, "still searching for their comrades, still trying to find their way home." For Tom, the encounter with the Lost Patrol was a sobering reminder of the human cost of war. "It's one thing to read about the men who were lost in the battle," he says, "but to see them, to feel their presence, it changes you. You realize that the war never really ended for them. They're still out there, still trying to find their way back." Tom has returned to Polygon Wood several times since that day, but he has never seen the Lost Patrol again. Still, the memory of the soldiers haunts him, and he often finds himself wondering what became of them, whether they ever found peace, or whether they are still wandering the forest, searching for something that can never be found. The Lost Patrol of Polygon Wood serves as a haunting reminder of the confusion and terror that characterized much of the fighting during the Battle of Passchendaele. Many soldiers were separated from their units in the chaos of battle, their bodies never recovered. The spectral figures seen in the forest may represent those lost men, forever wandering the battlefield in search of the comrades they left behind. For visitors to Polygon Wood, the presence of the Lost Patrol is a poignant reminder of the disorientation and isolation that defined the lives and deaths of so many soldiers during World War I. The wood, once a place of beauty, became a place of death and destruction, and the soldiers who fought there may still be walking its paths, their souls unable to find rest. Story 4. The Trench of Shadows. The trenches of World War I were places of unimaginable horror, where soldiers lived and died in squalor, surrounded by mud, rats, and the constant threat of death. The trenches at Passchendaele were some of the worst, filled with water and mud so deep that men often drowned in them. Today, few traces of the trenches remain, but visitors to the battlefield report eerie encounters in areas where the trenches once stood. The most famous of these is the Trench of Shadows, a stretch of land where strange apparitions and ghostly figures are said to appear, as if the soldiers who died there are still standing watch. The Trench of Shadows is located near what was once the front line during the Battle of Passchendaele. The area, now a quiet field, was once a muddy, waterlogged trench system where men lived, fought, and died in the most horrific conditions imaginable. The ground is still scarred by the battle, and the sense of loss is palpable to those who visit. It is here, in this desolate stretch of land, that the Trench of Shadows is said to appear, a place where the spirits of the dead seem to linger, their figures visible only in the fading light of dusk. Sarah Reed, a Canadian journalist writing a book on World War I, visited Passchendaele in the early 1990s as part of her research. She had heard the stories of the battlefield's hauntings, but was skeptical until she experienced something she couldn't explain. Sarah had spent the day visiting various memorials and sites of interest, learning about the history of the battle and interviewing locals. As the sun began to set, she decided to walk one last time through the area where the front-line trenches had once stood. The ground was soft and uneven, and Sarah imagined how difficult it must have been for the soldiers to navigate the muddy, waterlogged trenches. As she walked, she noticed something strange, a shadowy figure standing a few meters away. At first, she thought it was a fellow visitor, but as she approached, the figure didn't move. It stood still, watching her, its outline barely visible in the fading light. Sarah called out, but there was no response. Suddenly, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to leave, but as she did, she noticed more figures appearing in the distance, dark shapes moving silently through the field, as if following a path long forgotten. The figures were indistinct, their faces hidden, but their presence was unmistakable. They moved in single file, as if marching along the trench line, their forms blending into the twilight. Sarah stood frozen, watching as the shadowy figures moved past her, their movements slow and deliberate. They made no sound, but the air was thick with a sense of dread, as if the ghosts of the soldiers were still trapped in the nightmare of the trenches, unable to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figures vanished, leaving Sarah standing alone in the field. She hurried back to her car, her heart racing, but the memory of the shadowy figures stayed with her long after she left Passchendaele. Sarah struggled to understand what she had seen in the Trench of Shadows. As a journalist, she was used to dealing in facts and evidence, and the idea of seeing ghosts or spirits went against everything she believed. But the figures she had seen in the field were too real, too tangible, to dismiss as a mere illusion. In the days following her visit to Passchendaele, Sarah began researching the history of the trenches in the area, trying to find any record of soldiers who had died in that particular stretch of land. She discovered that many of the soldiers who had fought in the trenches at Passchendaele had been buried where they fell, their bodies lost to the mud and chaos of battle. It was possible, Sarah realized, that the shadowy figures she had seen were the spirits of those soldiers, still standing watch over the battlefield where they had lost their lives. For Sarah, the encounter with the shadowy figures in the Trench of Shadows was a moment of profound reflection. I had always approached the war from a historical perspective, she says, but seeing those figures standing there in the fading light, it made me realize that the soldiers who died at Passchendaele are still a part of that place. They're still there, standing watch, guarding the battlefield where they fought and died. Sarah now believes that the spirits of the soldiers who died in the trenches of Passchendaele are still present on the battlefield, their figures appearing in the twilight as a reminder of the suffering and sacrifice that took place on that muddy, war-torn ground. They're part of the land now, she says. They'll never leave. The Trench of Shadows is a haunting representation of the trauma and loss that defined life in the trenches during World War I. The men who fought and died in the trenches of Passchendaele experienced unimaginable suffering, and many of them were buried where they fell, their bodies lost to the mud. The shadowy figures that appear in the fields may represent the souls of those soldiers, still standing watch over the battlefield where they lost their lives. For visitors to Passchendaele, the Trench of Shadows is a powerful reminder of the enduring legacy of the war and the men who gave their lives in one of the most horrific battles in history. The battlefield, once a place of death and destruction, is now a place of quiet reflection, but the shadows of the past still linger, a reminder that the ghosts of the Great War are never far away. The Battle of Passchendaele was one of the most devastating battles of World War I, leaving behind a legacy of death, destruction, and unimaginable suffering. The fields of Passchendaele, once a vibrant landscape, were transformed into a muddy wasteland where men drowned in the mud and entire units were wiped out in the blink of an eye. It is no wonder that the spirits of the dead are said to linger on the battlefield, their presence felt by those who visit the site today. The stories of the soldier in the shell hole, the phantom voices in Incite Cemetery, the lost patrol in Polygon Wood, and the Trench of Shadows are just a few examples of the many hauntings associated with Passchendaele. These tales serve as a reminder that the men who fought and died in the Great War are still a part of the land, their spirits bound to the battlefield where they lost their lives. For those who visit Passchendaele, the experience is one of both reflection and reverence. The battlefield is a place where the past and present collide, where the voices of the dead can still be heard, and where the shadows of the Great War linger, waiting for someone to remember their sacrifice.